Hey, so we last left Sophie in the Queen's bedroom getting ready for the breakfast at the palace, and the BFG was on his way to the ballroom because the Queen thought that had the highest ceilings, so he would fit the best in there. So right now, we're going to open up and read the royal breakfast. There was a frantic scurry among the palace servants when orders were received from the Queen that a 24-foot giant must be served with Her Majesty in the great ballroom within the next half hour. The butler, an imposing personage named Mr. Tibbs, was in supreme command of all the palace servants, and he did the best he could in the short time available. A man does not rise to become the Queen's butler unless he is gifted with extraordinary ingenuity, adaptability, versatility, dexterity, cunning, sophistication, sagacity, discretion, and a host of other talents that neither you or I possess. Mr. Tibbs had them all. He was in the butler's pantry, sipping an early morning glass of light ale when the order reached him. In a split second, he had made the following calculations in his head. If a normal 6-foot man requires a 3-foot-high table to eat off of, a 24-foot giant will require a 12-foot-high table. And if a 6-foot man requires a chair with a 2-foot-high seat, a 24-foot giant will require a chair with an 8-foot-high seat. Everything, Mr. Tibbs told himself, must be multiplied by 4. 2 breakfast eggs must become 8. 4 rashers of bacon must become 16. 3 pieces of toast must become 12, and so on. These calculations about food were immediately passed on to Monsieur Papillon, the royal chef. Mr. Tibbs skimmed into the ballroom. Butlers don't walk, they skim over the ground, followed by a whole army of footmen. The footmen all wore knee breeches, and every one of them displayed beautifully rounded calves and ankles. There is no way you can become a royal footman unless you have a well-turned ankle. It is the first thing they look at when you are interviewed. "Push the grand piano into the center of the room," Mr. Tibbs whispered. Butlers never raise their voices above the softest whisper. 4 footmen moved the piano. "Now, fetch a large chest of drawers and put it on top of the piano," Mr. Tibbs whispered. 3 other footmen fetched a very fine Chippendale mahogany chest of drawers and placed it on top of the piano. "That will be his chair," Mr. Tibbs whispered. "It is exactly 8 feet off the ground. Now, we shall make a table upon which this gentleman may eat his breakfast in comfort. Fetch me 4 very tall grandfather clocks. There are plenty of them around the palace. Let each clock be 12 feet high." 16 footmen spread out around the palace to find the clocks. They were not easy to carry and required 4 footmen to each one. "Place the 4 clocks in a rectangle, 8 feet by 4 feet, alongside the grand piano," Mr. Tibbs whispered. The footmen did so. "Now, fetch me the young prince's ping-pong table," Mr. Tibbs whispered. The ping-pong table was carried in. "Unscrew its legs and take them away," Mr. Tibbs whispered. This was done. "Now, place the ping-pong table on top of the 4 grandfather clocks," Mr. Tibbs whispered. To manage this, the footmen had to stand on step-ladders. Mr. Tibbs stood back to survey the new furniture. "None of it is in the classic style," he whispered, "but it will have to do." He gave orders that a damask tablecloth should be wrapped over the ping-pong table, and in the end, it looked really quite elegant after all. At this point, Mr. Tibbs was seen to hesitate. The footmen all stared at him, aghast. Butlers never hesitate, not even when they are faced with the most impossible problems. It is their job to be totally decisive at all times. "Knives and forks and spoons," Mr. Tibbs was heard to mutter. "Our cutlery will be like little pins in his hands." But Mr. Tibbs didn't hesitate for long. "Tell the head gardener," he whispered, "that I require immediately a brand new, unused garden fork and also a spade. And for a knife, we shall use the great sword hanging on the wall in the morning room. But clean the sword well first. It was last used to cut off the head of King Charles I, and there may still be a little dried blood on the blade." When all this had been accomplished, Mr. Tibbs stood near the center of the ballroom, casting his expert butler's eye over the scene. Had he forgotten anything? He certainly had. What about a coffee cup for the large gentleman? "Fetch me," he whispered, "the biggest jug you can find in the kitchen." A splendid 1-gallon porcelain water jug was brought in and placed on the giant's table beside the garden fork and the garden spade and the great sword. So much for the giant. Mr. Tibbs then had the footman move a small, delicate table and 2 chairs alongside the giant's table. This was for the Queen and for Sophie. The fact that the giant's table and chair towered far above the smaller table simply could not be helped. All these arrangements were only just completed when the Queen, now fully dressed in a trim skirt and cashmere cardigan, entered the ballroom holding Sophie by the hand. A pretty blue dress that had once belonged to one of the princesses had been found for Sophie, and to make her look prettier still, the Queen had picked up a superb sapphire brooch from her dressing table and had pinned it on the left side of Sophie's chest. The big friendly giant followed behind them, but he had an awful job getting through the door. He had to squeeze himself through on his hands and knees, with 2 footmen pushing him from behind and 2 pulling from the front. But he got through in the end. He had removed his black cloak and got rid of his trumpet, and was now wearing his ordinary simple clothes. As he walked across the ballroom, he had to stoop quite a lot to avoid hitting the ceiling. Because of this, he failed to notice an enormous crystal chandelier. Crash! Went his head right into the chandelier. A shower of glass fell upon the floor. Fell upon the poor BFG. "Gung hummers and bogswinkles," he cried. "What was that?" "It was Louis XV, the Queen said, looking slightly put out. "He's never been in a house before," Sophie said. Mr. Tibbs scowled. He directed 4 footmen to clear up the mess. Then, with a disdainful little wave of the hand, he indicated to the giant that he should seat himself on top of the chest of drawers on top of the grand piano. "What a fizz-whizzing flash-bunking seat," cried the BFG. "I is going to be bug as a snug in a rug up here." "Does he always speak like that?" the Queen asked. "Quite often," Sophie said. "He gets tangled up with his words." The BFG sat down on the chest of drawers piano and gazed in wonder around the great ballroom. "By gumdrops," he cried, "what a spliffling whopsy room we is in. It is so gigantuous, I is needing binoculars and telescopes to see what is going on at the other end." Footmen arrived carrying silver trays with fried eggs, bacon, sausages, and fried potatoes. At this point, Mr. Tibbs suddenly realized that in order to serve the BFG at his 12-foot-high grandfather clock table, he would have to climb to the top of one of the tall stepladders. What's more, he must do it balancing a huge warm plate on the palm of one hand and holding a gigantic silver coffee pot in the other. A normal man would have flinched at the thought of it. But good butlers never flinch. Up he went, up and up and up, while the Queen and Sophie watched him with great interest. It is possible they were both secretly hoping he would lose his balance and go crashing to the floor. But good butlers never crash. So there they are, watching what's happening over here. At the top of the ladder, Mr. Tibbs, balancing like an acrobat, poured the BFG's coffee and placed the enormous plate before him. On the plate, there were 8 eggs, 12 sausages, 16 rashers of bacon, and a heap of fried potatoes. "What is this, please, your Magister?" the BFG asked, peering down at the Queen. He has never eaten anything except snozcumbers before in his life, Sophie explained. They taste revolting. They don't seem to have stunted his growth, the Queen said. The BFG grabbed the garden spade and scooped up all the eggs, sausages, bacon, and potatoes in one go and shoveled them into his enormous mouth. By goggles, he cried, this stuff is making snozcumbers taste like swatchwallop. The Queen glanced up, frowning. Mr. Tibbs looked down at his toes, and his lips moved in silent prayer. That was only one titchy little bite, the BFG said. Is you having any more of this delunctuous grubble in your cupboard, Magister? Tibbs, the Queen said, showing true regal hospitality, fetch the gentleman another dozen fried eggs and a dozen sausages. Mr. Tibbs swam out of the room, muttering unspeakable words to himself and wiping his brow with a white handkerchief. The BFG lifted the huge jug and took a swallow. Ouch, he cried, blowing a mouthful across the ballroom. Please, what is this horrible swig pill I is drinking, Magister? It's coffee, the Queen told him, freshly roasted. It's filthsome, the BFG cried out. Where is the frobscottle? The what? The Queen asked. Delumptuous, fizzy frobscottle, the BFG answered. Everyone must be drinking frobscottle with breakfast, Magister. Then we can all be whiz-popping happily together afterwards. What does he mean? The Queen said, frowning at Sophie. What is whiz-popping? Sophie kept a very straight face. BFG, she said, there is no frobscottle here, and whiz-popping is strictly forbidden. What? Cried the BFG. No frobscottle? No whiz-popping? No glumptious music? No boom, boom, boom? Absolutely not, Sophie told him firmly. If he wants to sing, please don't stop him, the Queen said. He doesn't want to sing, Sophie said. He said he wants to make music, the Queen went on. Shall I send for a violin? No, Your Majesty, Sophie said. He's only joking. A sly little smile crossed the BFG's face. Listen, he said, peering down at Sophie. If they isn't having any frobscottle here in the palace, I can still go whiz-popping perfectly well without it, if I is trying hard enough. No, cried Sophie. Don't. You are not to. I beg you. Music is very good for the digestion, the Queen said. When I'm up in Scotland, they play the bagpipes outside the window while I'm eating. Do play something. I has Her Majesty's permission, cried the BFG, and all at once he let fly a whiz-popper that sounded as though a bomb had exploded in the room. The Queen jumped. Whoopee! Shouted the BFG. That is better than baglepipes, is it not, Magister? It took the Queen a few seconds to get over the shock. I prefer the bagpipes, she said, but she couldn't stop herself from smiling. During the next 20 minutes, a whole relay of footmen were kept busy hurrying to and from the kitchen, carrying third helpings and fourth helpings and fifth helpings of fried eggs and sausages for the ravenous and delighted BFG. When the BFG had consumed his 72nd fried egg, Mr. Tibbs sidled up to the Queen. He bent low from the waist and whispered in her ear. Chief sends his apologies, Your Majesty, and he says he has no more eggs in the kitchen. What's wrong with the hens? The Queen said. Nothing's wrong with the hens, Your Majesty, Mr. Tibbs whispered. Then tell them to lay more, the Queen said. She looked up at the BFG. Have some toast and marmalade while you're waiting, she said to him. The toast is finished, Mr. Tibbs whispered, and Chef says there is no more bread. Tell him to bake more, the Queen said. While all this was going on, Sophie had been telling the Queen everything, absolutely everything about her visit to Giant Country. The Queen listened, appalled. When Sophie had finished, the Queen looked up at the BFG, who was sitting high above her. He was now eating a sponge cake. Big friendly giant, she said, last night those man-eating brutes came to England. Can you remember where they went the night before? The BFG put a whole round sponge cake into his mouth and chewed it slowly while he thought about this question. Yes, Magister, he said. I do think I is remembering where they said they was going the night before last. They was galloping off to Sweden for the sweet and sour taste. Fetch me a telephone, the Queen commanded. Mr. Tibbs placed the instrument on the table. The Queen lifted the receiver. Get me the King of Sweden, she said. Good morning, the Queen said. Is everything all right in Sweden? Everything is terrible, the King of Sweden answered. There is panic in the capital. 2 nights ago, 26 of my loyal subjects disappeared. My whole country is in a panic. Your 26 loyal subjects were all eaten by giants, the Queen said. Apparently, they like the taste of Swedes. Why do they like the taste of Swedes? The King asked. Because the Swedes of Sweden have a sweet and sour taste. So says the BFG, the Queen said. I don't know what you are talking about, the King said, growing testy. It's hardly a joking matter when one's loyal subjects are being eaten like popcorn. They've eaten mine as well, the Queen said. Who's they, for heaven's sake? The King asked. Giants, the Queen said. Look here, the King said. Are you feeling all right? It's been a rough morning, the Queen said. First, I had a horrid nightmare. Then the maid dropped my breakfast, and now I've got a giant on the piano. You need a doctor, quick, cried the King. I'll be all right, the Queen said. I must go now. Thanks for your help. She replaced the receiver. Your BFG is right, the Queen said to Sophie. Those 9 man-eating brutes did go to Sweden. It's horrible, Sophie said. Please stop them, Your Majesty. I'd like to make one more check before I call out the troops, the Queen said. Once more she looked up at the BFG. He was eating donuts now, popping them into his mouth 10 at a time, like peas. Think hard, BFG, she said. Where did those horrid giants say they were galloping off to 3 nights ago? The BFG thought long and hard. Ho, ho, he cried at last. Yes, I is remembering. Where? Asked the Queen. One was off to Baghdad, the BFG said. As they is galloping past my cave, Flesh Lump Eater is waving his arms and shouting at me. I is off to Baghdad, and I is going to Baghdad, and Mum and every one of their 10 children as well. Once more the Queen lifted the receiver. Get me the Lord Mayor of Baghdad, she said. If they don't have a Lord Mayor, get me the next best thing. In 5 seconds, a voice was on the line. Here is the Sultan of Baghdad speaking, the voice said. Listen, Sultan, the Queen said. Did anything unpleasant happen in your city 3 nights ago? Every night unpleasant things are happening in Baghdad, the Sultan said. We are chopping off people's heads like you are chopping parsley. I've never chopped parsley in my life, the Queen said. I want to know if anyone has disappeared recently in Baghdad. Only my uncle, Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the Sultan said. He disappeared from his bed 3 nights ago, together with his wife and 10 children. There you is, cried the BFG, whose wonderful ears enabled him to hear what the Sultan was saying to the Queen on the telephone. Flesh Lump Eater did that one. He went off to Baghdad and Mum and all the little kittles. The Queen replaced the receiver. That proves it, she said, looking up at the BFG. Your story is apparently quite true. Summon the head of the army and the head of the Air Force immediately. The next chapter is called The Plan. The head of the army and the head of the Air Force stood at attention beside the Queen's breakfast table. Sophie was still in her seat, and the BFG was still high up on his crazy perch. It took the Queen only 5 minutes to explain the situation to the military men. I knew there was something like this going on, Your Majesty, the head of the army said. For the last 10 years, we have been getting reports from nearly every country in the world about people disappearing mysteriously in the night. We had one only the other day from Panama. For the hattie taste, cried the BFG. And one from Wellington in New Zealand, said the head of the army. For the booty flavor, cried the BFG. What is he talking about? Said the head of the Air Force. Work it out for yourself, the Queen said. What time is it? 10 a.m.? In 8 hours, those 9 bloodthirsty brutes will be galloping off to gobble up another couple of dozen unfortunate wretches. They have to be stopped. We must act fast. We'll bomb the blighters, shouted the head of the Air Force. We'll mow them down with machine guns, cried the head of the army. I do not approve of murder, the Queen said. But they are murderers themselves, cried the head of the army. That is no reason why we should follow their example, the Queen said. 2 wrongs don't make a right. And 2 rights don't make a left, cried the BFG. We must bring them back alive, the Queen said. How? The 2 military men said together. They are all 50 feet high. They'd knock us down like 9-pins. Wait, cried the BFG. Hold your horseflies. Keep your skirts on. I think I has the answer to the maiden's hair. Let him speak, the Queen said. Every afternoon, the BFG said, all these giants is in the land of Noddy. I can't understand a word this feller says, the head of the army snapped. Why doesn't he speak clearly? He means the land of Nod, Sophie said. It's pretty obvious. Exactly, cried the BFG. Every afternoon, all these 9 giants is lying on the ground snozzling away in a very deep sleep. They is always resting like that before they is galloping off to guzzle another helping of human beings. Go on, they said. So what? So, what you soldiers has to do is to creep up to the giants while they is still in the land of Noddy and tie their arms and legs with mighty ropes and whonking chains. Brilliant, the Queen said. That's all very well, said the head of the army, but how do we get the brutes back here? We can't load 50-foot giants onto trucks. Shoot 'em on the spot, that's what I say. The BFG looked down from his lofty perch and said, this time to the head of the Air Force, you is having belly poppers, is you not? Is he being rude? The head of the Air Force said. He means helicopters, Sophie told him. Then why doesn't he say so? Of course we have helicopters. Whopsy big belly poppers? Asked the BFG. Very big ones, the head of the Air Force said proudly, but no helicopter is big enough to get a giant like that inside it. You do not put him inside, the BFG said. You sling him underneath the belly of your belly popper and carry him like a torpedo. Like a what? Said the head of the Air Force. Like a torpedo, Sophie said. Could you do that, Air Marshal? The Queen asked. Well, I suppose we could, the head of the Air Force admitted grudgingly. Then get cracking, the Queen said. You will need 9 helicopters, 1 for each giant. Where is this place? The Air Force man said to the BFG. I presume you can pinpoint it on a map? Pinpoint, said the BFG. Map? I is never hearing these words before. Is this Air Force bean talking slush bungle? The Air Marshal's face turned the color of a ripe plum. He was not used to being told he was talking squashbumble. The Queen, with her usual admirable tact and good sense, came to the rescue. BFG, she said, can you tell us more or less where this giant country is? No, Magister, the BFG said, not on my Nellie. Then we're jiggered, cried the Army General. This is ridiculous, cried the Air Marshal. You must not be giving up so easy, the BFG said calmly. The first titchy bobstickle you meet, and you begin shouting you is biff-squiggled. The Army General was no more used to being insulted than the Air Marshal. His face began to swell with fury, and his cheeks blew out until they looked like 2 huge, ripe tomatoes. Your Majesty, he cried, we are dealing with a lunatic. I want nothing more to do with this ridiculous operation. The Queen, who was used to the tantrums of her senior officials, ignored him completely. BFG, she said, would you please tell these rather dim-witted characters exactly what to do? A pleasure, Magister, said the BFG. Now listen to me carefully, you 2 boot-bogglers. The military men began to twitch, but they stayed put. I is not having the foggiest idea where giant country is in the world, the BFG said, but I is always able to gallop there. I is galloping forthwards and backwards from giant country every night to blow my dreams into little tiddlers' bedrooms. I is knowing the way very well. So all you is having to do is this. Put your 9 big belly hoppers up in the air and let them follow me as I is galloping along. How long will the journey take? The Queen asked. If we is leaving now, the BFG said, we will be arriving just as the giants is having their afternoon snozzle. Splendid, said the Queen. Then, turning to the 2 military men, she said, prepare to leave immediately. The head of the army, who was feeling pretty miffed by the whole business, said, that's all very well, Your Majesty, but what are we going to do with the blighters once we've got them back? Don't you worry about that, the Queen told him. We'll be ready for them. Hurry up now, off you go. If it pleases Your Majesty, Sophie said, I should like to ride with the BFG to keep him company. Where will you sit? Asked the Queen. In his ear, Sophie said. Show them, BFG. The BFG got down from his high chair. He picked Sophie up in his fingers. He swiveled his huge right ear until it was parallel to the ground. Then he placed Sophie gently inside it. The heads of the army and the Air Force stood there, goggling. The Queen smiled. You really are rather a wonderful giant, she said. Magister, the BFG said, I is wishing to ask a very special thing from you. What is it? The Queen said. Could I please bring back here in the belly poppers all my collection of dreams? They is taking me years and years to collect, and I is not wanting to lose them. Why, of course, the Queen said. I wish you a safe journey. So, next time we read, we will find out if their plan to catch the giants will work.